Good afternoon from Helsinki to everybody. I'm Professor Hannu Juusola, and I'm a chairperson of the Finnish Institute in the Middle East, or FIME. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this international webinar on the future of the Iran nuclear deal. I now give the floor to Dr. Katarina Simonen, who will be chairing this event. Please, Katarina.
Thank you, Hannu. Good afternoon also from my part. I represent the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, and I'm delighted to have such an audience and such eminent speakers with us. The topic is most timely, the future of the Iran nuclear deal. And we are happy to discuss this with you because we found that very objective discussion is often lacking, and Iran is quite a hot topic. So it is important to understand what this is all about, especially from the point of view of arms control and non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So before I'm giving the floor to our speakers, just about the structure of the seminar. This is supposed to be a very interactive seminar. I know we have a high quality audience. So after the presentations, I encourage you to use the chat actively, as well as present questions and comments in the comments with the hand function of the Zoom. I'm trying to see every comment and give floor accordingly. But with these words, I'd like to give the floor first to the Pugwash Secretary General, Paolo Cotta Ramusino, who has been the Secretary General of Pugwash Conferences since 2002. Paolo is a retired professor of mathematical physics at the State University of Milan, Italy, and a senior researcher at the Italian National Institute of Nuclear Physics. Paolo has a long career in arms control and disarmament, and he's been a leading force in promoting the involvement of scientists in arms control and disarmament. As Secretary General of Pugwash, Paolo has continued Pugwash tradition of addressing the need of eliminating nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction and promoting dialogue among the P5 countries. Pugwash involves both scientists and non-scientists and prioritizes preservation of the basic principles of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that is, disarmament, non-proliferation, and access to nuclear energy for all the member states. Moreover, during Paolo's presidency, he's directed Pugwash to several Track 2 initiatives, especially in the Middle East and Asia. An organized meeting mixing experts with officials in critical regions where either nuclear weapons exist or a concern about nuclear proliferation has been developed in an effort to promote, in whatever ways possible, conflict resolution in these critical regions, including Iran, India and Pakistan, and Northeast Asia. Paolo, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like can you hear me? Okay, good. I would like just to make a quick comment, a quick series of comments about some technical aspect of nuclear energy, so we understand better the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the agreement with Iran. First of all countries that are member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty have what is called the inalienable rights to have nuclear energy for civilian purposes. So no country which is member of the NPT can deny the access to nuclear energy. The point is that the connection between nuclear energy and production of nuclear weapons is kind of subtle. You can shift from one to the other one very easily. Let's make some example of that. In order to have nuclear energy, you need to have uranium 235, which is normally 0.7%, to be raised up to 3.6% minimum. How do you do that? You see, the point is that first of all, you can you see the figure here? The picture? Yes. Okay. You have first of all to transform uranium into a gas, which is uranium hexafluoride. Then you put in a centrifuge here. You see, normally the uranium with U35 is lighter than the other uranium. So you make centrifuge here, and the uranium 235 is collected in the center of the centrifuge. Centrifuge plan looks like this. You have several, put in series, several centrifuges, and then the material shift from one.
Paolo, at least me, I can't see the.
Yeah, we don't see your presentation at the moment.
No, the figure. It's only a figure. Do you see the figure?
Nope.
We don't see it.
Ah, what can I do? I don't know what to do. I thought I was able to.
Will you restart the screen share, please?
Okay, restart the screen. Yes. Okay. Can you see now this? No. What can I do? Shall I switch it off and on? I don't know what. Doesn't matter. I mean, at this point, we are losing just time. So you have to put. I'm sorry. Okay. So do you see the? You see it now or not? No.
No. Would you like to send it to me? I can share it.
Okay, it doesn't matter. Look, let's stop sharing and then go. So you put the uranium gas, uranium hexafluoride into centrifuge that we spin around the gas and collect at the center the gas which is lighter, which is made by uranium 235. Then you select from uranium the natural uranium, which is only 0.7% to uranium 235, you reach the point where you have 3.6%. And it's a minimum one you can use in order to work in a civilian nuclear energy plan. The most important point is that there is a work in order to select the uranium 235. So if you reach the point at which 3.6%, you want to compare with what you need in order to have a nuclear weapons. And in order to have a nuclear weapons, you need, instead of 3.6%, you need to have something 90%. You think it's a big difference. It is not. When you have reached 3.6%, you have done half of the work which is needed to go to 90%. Which is the first message here is that the distinction between producing uranium, which is used for nuclear energy plants and for nuclear weapons, is not so different. When we have produced uranium up to the point which is needed in order to have what you want to have for power plants, you have halfway to go to the nuclear weapon. So you need to know what is your capability and the number of centrifuges you have. And you need to, essentially, check from a reliable institution, namely the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, what we are doing. That's the need of controlling all nuclear activities in order to prevent that countries will produce material which will be needed in order to create a nuclear weapon. And Iran has been made some mistakes at the beginning. Okay, it acquired centrifuges, which I'm sorry I cannot show in figure. They acquired a centrifuge from Pakistan, in particular for Make You Can, and these centrifuges were already, so to say, dirty with uranium. So at some point, the atomic energy in Vienna agency realized that Iran has somehow started enriching uranium, and this is contrary to what is required by an agreement which each country is supposed to make with the Atomic Energy Agency, and which is called Safeguards Agreement. So technically, Iran was faulty of going around the Safeguard Agreement. Was Iran the only country which did so? Not at all. Typical example has been Korea in 2000, 2002. In fact, it made a lot of attempt of enriching uranium before. Am I talking on North Korea? No, sir. I'm talking about South Korea. I'm talking about the fact that South Korea for many years, they essentially did not respect the Safeguards Agreement. The quantity of enriched uranium was minimal, but nevertheless, there was something which was broken, a law which was broken. Did South Korea got all the trouble that Iran got when they discovered that it did not respect the agreement? Not at all. They said to South Korea, good guys, next time do something else. And that's it, finished. Iran, no. Iran was under pressure from many countries, including the United States, and so they started a complicated process of denouncing Iran to the National Security Council of the United States. Iran, in 2003, stopped any enrichment and, in fact, decided to apply what is called the additional protocol, which is an extra condition with respect to the Safeguards Agreement I was mentioning before. The President Khatami decided to abide to these rules and not to enrich anymore. That did not work. It was denounced to the UN Security Council, and the UN Security Council decided to put sanctions on Iran. Totally different attitude from the South Korean attitude that I mentioned before. Okay, so you see, the point is that if there has been at the beginning some unfair treatment of Iran, which has been very important in understanding all the controversy that happened afterwards. So we discussed about the uranium enrichment procedure that can be easily extended to create the uranium enough needed for nuclear weapons. But there is something else. You can have, instead of the normal, which is called light water nuclear reactors, you can have heavy waters nuclear reactors. You can have a reactor where instead of water, which is used as a coolant and in a reactor, you can use heavy water. Heavy water, what is heavy water? Heavy water is just water, where instead of hydrogen, you substitute with deuterium, which has one extra neutron. In this way, the role of water, which is not a cooling, but is also to absorb neutrons, is much less. And so the neutron flow that you put inside the procedure will be essentially less blocked by water. And you can use, instead of using water, instead of using enriched uranium, we can use natural uranium. So we say, well, then we are okay, we are safe. Not at all, unfortunately. When you use, instead of enriched uranium to 3.6%, you use natural uranium, which is 0.7%. Yes, you have less uranium-235, but you have much more uranium-238. And when uranium-238 is bombarded by neutrons, then you get plutonium-238, which can use it for a different kind of bomb. Enriched uranium, uranium-235, is used in bomb of the type like Hiroshima, while the plutonium is used in bomb like the one which has been used in Nagasaki. So all the moral is this: all nuclear civilian activities can be easily transformed into activities that can lead to the production of nuclear weapons. Constructing nuclear weapons is much easier than building a nuclear energy facility. Okay, I'm teaching to my student how to build a nuclear weapon. I did not do it, but that's okay. It's easy. So the difference between having countries which produce nuclear weapon and not is one single thing: control. If the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna is able to control the activity of that country, then that country will not produce material used for nuclear weapons. The Atomic Energy Agency has been devoted lots of energy and attention to Iran, much more than any other country. But at some point, despite all of this activity and control, the UN International Security Council, UN Security Council, decided to sanction Iran. And then you have also a shift from President Khatami to President Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad said, okay, guys, we are going on, we don't care anymore, and we are building our own nuclear energy, and you are not allowed to come and see it. More than the additional protocol, which was something extra with respect to the safeguard agreement, has been somehow dismissed. And Ahmadinejad produced lots of centrifuges, and the field grew up. Then in 2013, 2015, between 2013 and 2015, we have the agreement. The characteristics of this agreement, that is called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is not an agreement, since it's not a treaty, since the United States cannot use the term treaty unless it is approved by the Senate. And you need 2/3 of the Senate to approve a treaty. So you have, at this point, you had a set of strong constraints on Iran, which have no parallel with any other country. Iran in 2015 accepted a series of constraints that no other country accepted. So everything was set, yes, but then Trump arrived and killed everything. Not only it killed the agreement with the de facto agreement with Iran, but also said, well, we are restoring that United States, we are restoring the sanctions, and we are also using secondary sanctions. So we are sanctioning all the countries that do not respect the sanction that we are imposing on Iran. And in that way, the situation collapsed. With Biden, can it came back? Came back. We don't know. Maybe yes, we have to know what is going on in these days. But certainly, the attitude changed not so fast as it should have been. Since now we have Biden since 1 year and a half, 1 year and a month, and we in 2 years. Sorry, now we are getting 2 years. So we still don't have an agreement working, the restoration of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, unless something happened today, which Katerina will tell us if this is the case. But so that's it. That's my 5 minutes or 10 minutes introduction to some technical aspect, and I think that that's it.
Okay, thank you, Paolo. I will have you some questions at the Q&A session regarding the technical aspects, but I'll leave them later on, so we can have Trita. So, Dr. Parsi, you have a very long list of merits. I'm trying to make you justice and pick the key elements, but please excuse me if I missed something. Dr. Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the former President of the largest Iranian American grassroots organization in the US, the NIAC, the National Iranian American Council. Trita has taught at Johns Hopkins University, New York University, and George Washington University, and is currently teaching at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Trita is an award-winning author with a focus on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. The first book, Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the U.S., published by Yale in 2007, won the Grawemeyer Award and Council of Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Award in 2008, Silver Medallion. In 2021, Trita was named by the Washington Magazine as one of the 50 most influential voices of foreign policy in Washington, D.C. Your second book, The Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, again Yale in 2012, was selected as the best book on the Middle East in 2012 by Foreign Affairs. The latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, Yale 2017, reveals the behind-the-scenes story to the historic nuclear deal with Iran. It is a pleasure to have you, Trita, in this seminar. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you, and great to see old friends from Paolo to Hannu to Tytti and Christina, Katerina, of course. Paolo gave an excellent overview of the technicalities of building a bomb. Not sure if you should share all of that information, Paolo, but also of the history of how this issue has developed and the way one could argue that Iran has been singled out. What I want to focus on is not whether there will be a deal in the next couple of days. I believe there will be a deal, but rather what the difference is between this deal and the previous deal will be, at least in terms of its implications. First of all, clearly by now, enough changes have been made to the original deal that the White House expects that there will be an Inara fight, meaning that this issue will go to Congress. Congress will have 60 days to review, after which they will have to pass a resolution of disapproval in order to reject the deal. Most likely they will not succeed in doing so, because as long as the White House has 41 votes in the US Senate, that resolution will not pass, and as a result, Congress will have failed to prevent the deal. This is similar to what happened before, but earlier on, there was expectations that perhaps by just making the deal as similar as possible to the previous one, this fight could be avoided. It seems like it's unlikely to be avoided at this point. But the biggest difference, I would say, is that in 2015, the JCPOA was signaling a change in the trajectory of US-Iran relations. It had the potential of shifting that relationship, which had at the time been a very deep enmity for 35 years. It would not mean necessarily that it would be US and Iran would become allies, but it was clear that it was moving in a direction in which the old trend had been broken. Take, for instance, what happened just a couple of days or hours before implementation day, when a few American sailors accidentally got themselves into Iranian waters in the Persian Gulf. 5 phone calls directly between John Kerry and Zarif was sufficient to resolve that issue in 16 hours. Today, if such a crisis were to occur, it would be a major problem, and it would be quite unlikely that those soldiers would be released. Under other times, it would probably have led to war. But this was resolved in 16 hours through direct diplomacy because of the report that the US Secretary of State had with the Iranian foreign minister. Today, what we're seeing, because of the manner in which this deal has been renewed, and there I would put primarily impetus on how the US chose to do so. The Biden administration could have chosen to just do an executive order or go back into the deal. Whatever issues remained could have been resolved while the US was still in the deal, had the moral authority of having rejoined the deal. Moreover, much of the very problematic activities that the Iranians have engaged in the course of the last year would not have taken place. So, as we are talking about here, that the breakout capability of Iran has shrunk to a couple of weeks, well, that wasn't the case in January 2021. It could have been paused right there, and the remaining issues could have been resolved from inside the deal. The Biden administration chose not to do this. Instead, they chose to spend the first 2 months of his presidency to consult with the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Emiratis in the hope that they would be able to neutralize or at least minimize their opposition to the JCPOA. From the Iranian perspective, I believe that was read quite differently. It was not read as an effort to reduce political challenges that Biden would face from these three countries, but rather it was read as the United States deliberately delaying a return in order to have Trump's sanctions, which still are in place, squeeze the Iranian economy further and make sure that the Iranians would be in a more desperate situation in order for the US to go back in and get a longer and stronger deal. This is rhetoric that the administration used. There were people in the administration who said that it would be a shame to not use Trump sanctions to get a better deal, to get a stronger deal. During the transition, they weren't saying this in government, but the US was very clear that he wanted to negotiate a longer and stronger deal. This seems to have then compelled the Iranians to decide to accelerate their nuclear program much more so than they did during the Trump years. Because if the United States was going to use those sanctions as leverage, then Iran needed counter leverage. In essence, I think they viewed Biden's position not being terribly different from that of Trump. Trump also said that he wanted to negotiate, but he wanted to have these maximum pressure sanctions as leverage. Now the Iranians were essentially perceiving the same thing. So by the time they started talking later in March of that year, mistrust was already much greater than it was before. Major disappointment. Expectations may have been exaggerated, but disappointment and disillusion was already very clear. The Iranians refused to engage with the United States directly. Instead, it had to be done through the mediation of the EEAS and Enrique Mora, a Spanish diplomat who's done a great job in shepherding this process forward. But it meant, in essence, that everything would be dramatically slowed down. And if there was one thing that did not exist in excess, it was time. Because after the Iranian New Year on March 21st, the Iranians entered into their political season with the presidential elections. And while negotiations continued, it became quite clear that the Iranians did not have the authority to come to a decision until after the new president had been inaugurated, which did not take place until August. And after that, the Iranians took several more months to say that they wanted to prepare their new position and study what had been negotiated before. So talks did not begin until end of November or early December. Plenty of time was lost. And here you could see that the Iranian conduct was now dramatically reducing the American goodwill and perceptions. The American side started to genuinely believe that the Iranians actually were not interested in a deal, but rather were playing for time to just advance their program as much as possible and present the United States with a fait accompli. It took some time before they came to the conclusion that the Iranians were serious about a deal, but it just might not be the same deal that the US was serious about, and vice versa. All of this, and a key element that has made these negotiations, and the reason why I say that this will not be the same as 2015, is that throughout all of this, the Iranians asked for assurances that the United States would not walk out of the deal again, that it would not do what Trump had done. The Iranians could not afford to once again have their economy crushed, lose all of their nuclear leverage, because the US very quickly can reimpose sanctions. The United States stated that it cannot provide any such assurances. In fact, in the beginning, it did not even offer assurances that it would stay in the deal during the term of Biden himself. Later on, that was changed, but it's saying that it cannot tie the hands of the next president. Just as a side, this is a significant asymmetric situation in the deal, because the deal does contain assurances that the Iranians will not break the agreement. The United States made sure that in the UN Security Council resolution, a snapback provision was invented to ensure that if the Iranians pulled out of the agreement, instead of the United States having to spend 6 to 9 months building up political support for reimposing sanctions and overcoming a Russian and Chinese veto, instead, the Russians and the Chinese essentially gave up their veto and allowed any of the P5 states to snap back sanctions on Iran within 30 days. This was the assurance and the guarantee to make sure that the Iranians would not cheat on the deal. No such mechanism exists today or in the future deal that we're talking about to make sure that the US doesn't do this. This has now then led to a situation, and what seems to be the case in the deal is that the Iranians are going to keep very advanced centrifuges on their own soil under IAEA seal. The United States originally wanted those advanced centrifuges to be destroyed, similar to what was the case in the original deal. But precisely because the US could not provide any assurances that it's not going to pull out of the deal, the Iranians have insisted that as a result, they need to keep their advanced centrifuges, because that is the inherent assurance that the US will not pull out of the deal. Because if it does so, Iran can very quickly ramp up its nuclear program with these new advanced centrifuges. All in all, this has then created a scenario in which neither side expects this deal to last longer than 2.5 years. It is different from the last time, in which there was a fear that the other side might cheat. This time there's an expectation that the other side will cheat. So we're not going to see the same type of a deal. It's likely not going to survive it, even if there is a Democratic president in the United States in 2025, because the two sides are going to use this next 2.5 years to prepare themselves for the coming showdown in 2025, which to a large extent is coming about because of their expectations that this deal is not a stable. This means that rather than becoming a change in the trajectory of US-Iran relations, something that can be built upon and you can actually advance diplomacy to address other issues, this deal is most likely going to become little more than a respite, a pause in their hostilities for 2.5 years as they await to see what happens in 2025. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Trita. But we'll talk about it a bit further on. Thank you so much. So I'll introduce our third speaker, Dr. Tytti Erästö from SIPRI. She is a senior researcher in SIPRI's Nuclear Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Program. Her research interests include the Iran nuclear deal, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, efforts to establish a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, United States-Russian arms control treaties, and US-NATO-Russia missile defense dispute, global disarmament, and the non-proliferation regime more generally. She has worked at Ploughshares Fund in Washington, D.C., the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, Harvard Kennedy School, the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and the Tampere Peace Research Institute in Finland. Impressive, Tytti. The recent research publications include themes regarding missile defense in arms control talks, new technologies and nuclear disarmament, missile threats in the Middle East and North Africa, European non-proliferation diplomacy, and nuclear restraints, raising the threshold for nuclear weapon use. Tytti, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to speak here today. And I have to say it's an honor to share the floor with Paolo and Trita, whose books have also been very useful in my work. So I thought that I'd focus my talk on sanctions, which have played a central role, as you know, in the Iran nuclear issue from the beginning. And sanctions have also been portrayed as key to the diplomatic success that produced the JCPOA in 2015. Since the US withdrawal from the agreement, however, sanctions have almost killed the agreement. And so I argue that in reality, sanctions were never such great non-proliferation tools, even before 2015. And sanctions are also likely to remain the main threat to an agreement in Vienna if there will be a successful conclusion to those talks in the coming days or weeks. So the conventional wisdom in the United States and Europe is that their crippling sanctions, as they were called at the time, brought Iran to the negotiation table in 2013. However, the single most important factor that enabled the JCPOA was actually not sanctions, in my view, but a shift in US position regarding Iran's right to uranium enrichment. After arguing for about 10 years that Iran should not enrich any uranium, the United States signaled in secret talks with Iran that it could continue enrichment within certain limits, as Trita has documented in detail in his 2017 book. And this made all the difference because the previous Iranian insistence that it had a right to enrich uranium and the US insistence on zero enrichment, which the rest of the P5 group joined later, it didn't leave much room for discussion, really. So in early 2013, finally some ground was created for talks. And after that, the JCPOA was negotiated actually quite quickly. I mean, it took a few years, but still. And of course, sanctions lifting is a key part of the JCPOA, but it was really diplomacy based on compromise that made the deal possible. And this is not to say that sanctions and military threats didn't have any impact on Iran, but I would argue that this impact was largely negative, as it fueled an escalatory pattern whereby Iran responded to pressure by stepping up its nuclear program. It's even possible that a compromise could have been found already in 2003 when Iran made quite a bold negotiation offer to the Bush administration. But since compromise diplomacy was only tried after several years of sanctions, no one really knows. And I don't really want to dwell too much in the past, but it's important not to draw the wrong lessons from history, because it's misleading to say that sanctions brought Iran to the table. And unfortunately, this wrong lesson subsequently became the common wisdom, which was then applied and taken to the extreme by the Trump administration with disastrous consequences. More specifically, Trump's maximum pressure policy was based on the logic that the more pressure you exert on Iran, the more concessions you can get. In addition to going back to the previous zero enrichment demand, Iran was also asked to limit its missile testing and end support for non-state groups in the Middle East, among other things. And asking all of this, especially demanding all of this at the same time, was simply unrealistic. And the real goal probably was to weaken Iran based on the assumption that this could somehow magically fix all problems, ideally by leading to a collapse of the Iranian regime. In reality, the problems that the maximum pressure policy was supposed to fix only became worse as a result. In addition to stepping up its nuclear program and reducing the so-called breakout time, Iran also lashed out in the region, as seen, for example, in the attacks against Saudi oil facilities in 2019, even though they were supposedly conducted by the Houthis, but Iran was widely seen as having been involved. And the disillusionment with the JCPOA's unfulfilled promises to improve the Iranian economy also played a role, in the Iranian elections, resulting in a more hardline Iranian government last summer. So it's hard to overestimate the damage that was done by violating the basic international law principle that agreements are kept. The Trump administration cast a long shadow of doubt over any future agreements that might be reached between the US and Iran. Of course, there are also other parties in the deal, but I think the JCPOA, I mean, the problems have a lot to do with the bilateral US-Iranian relationship. So this highlighted the possibility that any agreement might not last beyond the next US elections. And this has implications not only for the Iran nuclear issue and non-proliferation more generally, but also for regional security. After all, many of Iran's destabilizing activities in the region are, at least in my view, a symptom of its conflict with the United States rather than just Iran's hegemonic ambitions in the region. And to come to the present, I think the good thing is that despite everything, it was nevertheless possible to start talks to restore the JCPOA after Biden took over last year. And as you know, the talks began in Vienna in the spring, about a bit less than 1 year ago, and there's now a chance that there will finally be an agreement. And unsurprisingly, a key sticking point in the talks has been sanctions. The Biden administration was ready to lift non-proliferation sanctions, but the problem is that many non-nuclear sanctions imposed by the Trump administration have had basically the same effect as those sanctions that were lifted under the JCPOA. In short, they are creating obstacles to trade between Iran and the rest of the world. And while lifting any sanctions on Iran is politically difficult in the United States, it's particularly hard now to lift sanctions that have been justified on grounds other than the nuclear issue, such as terrorism support. However, I would think the biggest challenge to diplomacy is precisely the problem that I just referred to and which Trita also discussed, namely the uncertainty created by the possibility that the United States might just pull out of the agreement in the near future. And as Trita mentioned, Iran has demanded guarantees that this won't happen, but it's kind of impossible to fully address this concern. And while uncertainty about this issue might not prevent a deal now, the possibility of a new US withdrawal will likely haunt the future of the agreement. But I don't want to be too pessimistic. I don't think this necessarily means that things will go wrong, but there are definitely uncertainties ahead. The Republicans remain very critical of the JCPOA and eager to keep sanctioning Iran, basically because Iran is regarded as the enemy of the United States, but also because the US Middle East allies have traditionally supported this policy of isolating Iran. From this perspective and the fact that relations between Iran and the Gulf Arab states have recently improved somewhat, I would like to argue that US allies could actually play a role in supporting the JCPOA. So I'm not talking about European allies here, but the Gulf allies, and more specifically Iran and Saudi Arabia. They held several rounds of dialogue last year, and relations between Iran and the United Arab Emirates also seem to have improved. Most importantly, neither country is opposed to the JCPOA anymore. So I know this might sound too optimistic, but I think if regional engagement continues and if it's seen to produce results in terms of improved security, then US policymakers who might not be so receptive to these other arguments that I was trying to make, they might become maybe more cautious when imposing sanctions on Iran. To conclude, sanctions are tools of economic warfare whose non-proliferation benefits are questionable. This is not to say that the threat of using sanctions or their proportionate use to achieve limited and well-defined goals could not create the desired effects in some cases. But once used, sanctions tend to become escalatory steps that are followed by more escalation. And in particular, an indiscriminate use of sanctions without clear goals or the ability to lift them credibly is unlikely to achieve any political objectives, except of course, if the only goal is to weaken your enemy. But a weakened and cornered enemy might actually become more dangerous, as I think was illustrated by the maximum pressure campaign. So to end with an optimistic note again, while the talks in Vienna show that it's still possible to de-escalate tensions by lifting sanctions, the big challenge is to keep them lifted. That was all from me, and I look forward to any comments or questions.
Thank you, Tytti, so much. I like your optimism also regarding the regional partners. There might be something in there, I think. Very good. Thank you. So with these presentations, it became clear that one of the key challenges was the fact that the US cannot buy the hands of the next administration. And unfortunately, what we are seeing here is another bad precedent. I'm comparing it to Ukraine in the sense that we are seeing a bad precedent of violation of the UN Charter regarding the use of force. But we are seeing a precedent here that pacta sunt servanda, the respect for treaties has become pacta sunt violanda. There is no guarantee that a treaty that has been made is kept, and that's very bad for the international system at large.
Okay, probably I can go on from here. So as far as I understood, the first question was about the regional implications of the treaty. How do you see, what are the possible implications given that the treaty will be there in the near future? And then the second part was about the role of Russia now in the midst of the Ukrainian war. How do you see it, if it has any implication? And anyone can take. I can.
Sure, I can first address the regional implications. There is a very significant change in the attitude of the Saudis and the Emiratis on this issue. I think Tytti referred to that as well, in which they now are in favor of the deal. I don't think they're excited about the deal. I don't think they're enthusiastic in any way, shape, or form. But they have come to realize that the United States is not going to come to their defense in case of a war. And as a result, they need de-escalation. This is not in and of itself a shift in their position towards improvement of relations with Iran writ large, but rather they do need to have some degree of de-escalation. And the Emiratis have reached out to the Iranians. The Iranians have reached out extensively to both the Iranians and the Saudis. The Saudis and the Iranians have been having their conversations in Baghdad under the auspices of the Iraqi government. It's been put on pause because of internal Iraqi politics at this point. But what they're all awaiting to see is if there is a deal or not. If there is a deal, I suspect you will see further efforts by these countries to reduce tensions between themselves and at a minimum make sure that if there's any military confrontation, they will not be a target. This is a dramatic shift from the position of these countries under the Trump administration, in which they were actively pushing Trump to go to war, thinking falsely that if war would happen, the United States would come to their defense. They realized rather quickly that was not the case when there were attacks against Saudi airfields, most likely by the Iranians, and the Trump administration essentially did nothing and said that they're not going to go to war with Iran on behalf of Saudi Arabia. Israel is in a different position. The Israelis continue to publicly oppose the deal. There are more voices inside of Israel that increasingly are saying that the deal is better than no deal. The opposite of what Netanyahu and what Bennett has been saying. From Bennett's perspective, one of the most important things is for him not to have bad relations with the Democratic President of the United States and to restore good relations with the Democrats in Congress, something that Netanyahu had severely damaged. And as a result, despite the opposition that the Israelis, at least under Bennett, still have to the deal, they're avoiding to take that fight to Congress or to DC. They are taking, to a certain extent, that fight to Vienna, however, because they've sent a delegation to Vienna. I don't think they have high expectations that they're going to be particularly successful in influencing the talks in Vienna, but they have been doing selective leaks about what is happening in the agreement, in the negotiations, that do appear to be aimed at complicating, if not undermining, the talks. It is still far less aggressive than it was during the Netanyahu years. There's been some tempering of it, but it's still not where I think the Biden administration would like to see the Israelis being. And the question is, what happens once there is a deal? Will the Israelis back off, or will they actually be under more pressure? Precisely because they too do not expect this deal to last more than 2.5 years, to actually intensify their attacks inside of Iran and their sabotage and perhaps even assassinations against Iranian nuclear scientists. That is a big question mark that we don't know the answer to yet.
Tytti, please.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe I could say something that I think, yeah, I think at least the Gulf countries seem to have realized that not having the JCPOA is not in their interest. I mean, they saw the negative security implications of that, and to some extent, I think the dialogue that is going on, I mean, we shouldn't maybe be, I mean, too optimistic about it, because there are a lot of challenges there too. But I think it's also it also would build on having the JCPOA in place. It's hard to see that going very far if the nuclear issue escalates. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, there's kind of a connection both ways, although in my talk I said, I mean, both issues kind of could contribute positively to each other. I was saying that the regional dialogue could help to maybe maintain the JCPOA, but I think the regional dialogue also, or this improvement of relations in the region, also requires the JCPOA, I mean, to keep in check Iran's nuclear ambitions, but also to prevent the US-Iranian conflict from escalating in a way that that is negative for everyone.
Thank you, Tytti. And then Paolo, please note that there are also questions on chat. So you can, when you respond, please. Yes, please.
Okay, I want to make two quick comments. First, about Iran and the Middle East. You see, the point is that Iran has been singled out and criticized generally for political reasons. There is no doubt that the agreement, the nuclear agreement with Iran, is an element for stability and peace. It's obvious. No one can deny that logically, but Israel can be concerned about the political recognition that is given to Iran, and that's something that they don't like. So it's a way in which, in particular, Israel is blind and does not see the benefit for its own security of the JCPOA. And I think that other countries are interested in having a nuclear war-free Middle East, and I think they should support the nuclear agreement with Iran, but did not do that since they were essentially blocked by the fact that having such recognition can give Iran a political role that they don't want him to have, it to have. About the second point about Ukraine, I think it's a totally different issue. I don't think that it will have any effect. The Ukrainian issue is already a complicated one. It's a terrible one. It's a very risky one. And essentially, Russia is put into a corner by several Western countries, and this is not absolutely reasonable nor good. We have to find ways out of the situation of the Ukrainian crisis, which are kind of not satisfying everybody, but at least acceptable to a certain extent by most of everybody. Most or everybody, we have to see. But I don't think that the issue of the Iran nuclear deal has anything to do with this.
Paolo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Two more questions about the context. You said Iran nuclear deal is very important. Could you say a few words about the larger context if you think of the NPT and Iran nuclear deal as a non-proliferation act? And second, I wrote you a question in the chat regarding the breakout time and the fact that if Iran were to produce nuclear weapons, how many? I mean, one bomb in the context of 6,000 bombs by the US and Russia. I mean, what are we talking about? How big is the risk? Could you comment on this, please?
Yes, I mean, let's start with this breakout time. You see, the point depends on how many centrifuges they have and how much they are working. The problem is that in order to have some nuclear weapons, can be 5, 10, 100, you don't need technology at high level. You need to have materials. And in order to have the material, namely the enriched uranium, then it depends. If you have 6,000 centrifuges, if you have 20,000 centrifuges, makes a difference. And one has to evaluate concretely. But then you have to assume, and that's the main answer, you have to assume that Iran is fully working with its own centrifuges in order to create nuclear weapons. And then if we know that this is going to happen, then I'm sure that there will have a reaction inside the Middle East of people who will say, okay, better to attack Iran now than later. And in this sense, I don't think it's really the breakout time is so relevant, in the sense that I don't think it is in the interest of Iran to be fully working on nuclear weapons construction. If they do something, they can have some few nuclear weapons hidden in the under the ground, and they can be built 10, they can be built 15 before they get out and decide we want to get out from the NPT. They should do that before, reasonably, before saying no, we want to get out of the NPT, but then don't have any nuclear weapons. They cannot do that. This will be illogical. They should prepare some nuclear weapons and they say, aha, we are getting out, like in North Korea. And in this case, I don't think it will be in the interest of Iran to do like this. And in this sense, just a commentary, a final comment, is that in requesting to enlarge the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to include other things like missile capabilities is the way in which you are making the agreement impossible, and you are not getting anything. Since the missile capability can be used also for civilian purposes and is not only used for nuclear weapons. And I think that it's better to stay with the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action than to go further. And that's it.